This is in response to Dr. Paul Krugman's article in the New York Times on Friday, June 19th, 2015. What was it? Voodoo Jeb exclamation point style. And Jeb doesn't want to be called Bush, so it's Jeb exclamation point. But he did declare his candidacy this week. Obviously, he and everyone else is going to be making some very broad-stroked claims, assertions, predictions, assurances of what they're going to do as president. Jeb went out this week, the first week that he declared, and said that he was going to bring about 4% growth rate in GDP if he became president. He didn't tell us necessarily how he was going to do it. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But he did say that he was going to do that. Dr. Krugman aptly points out that, if he's got this way that we can do a 4% GDP growth rate, then how come he didn't tell his father or his brother how they could do it, because they didn't achieve 4% growth rate when they were presidents of the United States? And so what type of information is Jeb privy to that he can make these types of predictions? And I don't want to talk too much about Jeb and what he wants to do with the election, but it looks like the way he started out, he looks like he wants to go all in. Looks like he has lost some weight. But as Donald Trump said, God, if you're ever going to declare yourself for any office, especially as President of the United States, you should be wearing a coat and tie. So obviously that's what Jeb's handlers had him doing. We'll see if that really plays in, that he's this, I don't know what they want to portray him to be. But to come out right at the beginning and say that you're going to have an economic plan of 4%, that's pretty good. Now, this is why I really want to talk about what Dr. Krugman has to say, because he brings truth to power. He points out of the last 5 presidents that we have had, not one of them has had a growth rate of 4%. Okay, so Clinton, 8 years, 3.7%. Reagan, 8 years, 3.4%. Obama, now 6.5 years, 2.1%. HW, only 4 years, 2%. And GW, Georgie boy, 8 years, 1.6%. Now remember, George Bush, when he came in 2000, we had a surplus. He says he wanted to give tax relief. All right, so everyone got a little bit of money, and really that wasn't real money. That was just an advance on your taxes. The real tax deductions went to the rich. And of course, we only had a 1.6% growth rate during George Bush's administration, George the younger Bush's administration, W's administration. So don't know where Jeb is coming off on all of this. As I said, many of these people are going to be wildly making predictions, assertions, assumptions, assurances, etc. This seems to be one of the bigger ones. Dr. Krugman then goes to point out, number one, if he did it, why didn't he tell his brother and his father? And number two, as I said, when you look at the last 5 presidents, not one of them have ever done it. And of course, let's take a quick look at Reagan, who is at 3.4%. Is that when he came in, there was high inflation, and that inflation had been dogging the United States because of the Vietnam War from the late 1960s, to the point that President Nixon had wage and price controls in 72, something like that, 73. When Gerald Ford got into office, he had WIN, which was a little little button over here that said WIN, whip inflation now. Carter had trouble with, they all had trouble with interest rates, and Carter brought in Volcker, which whatever he did helped bring the interest rates down, which helped out Reagan quite a bit. And remember, Reagan raised taxes on 11 separate occasions during his presidency. So if you want to say that then the growth rate was at 3.4%, it certainly seems like that could have happened. And of course, now some of the conservatives are saying that because H.W. Bush raised taxes in 1990, even though he said, read my lips, that that's what's really the tax increase that allowed Clinton to prosper in the Clinton administration. Of course, Clinton raised taxes, and the vote had to come from Al Gore because it was 50-50 in the Senate, I believe. And of course, then they had the highest rate of growth, had 22 million people who were gainfully employed, who gainfully got employment in the Clinton era, so to speak. So don't know where Jeb is coming from, but this is what's going on. Dr. Krugman also aptly points out that Jeb is sort of relying on some of this, is that he was such a great governor that he had a great GDP in the state of Florida. What he neglects to tell you is that Florida was under a housing bubble. I believe there were 4 or 5 states that were under the biggest housing bubbles, and that thing just shot through the roof. Unbelievable amount of foreclosures that went on in the housing bubbles that were limited to a couple states, and I believe that those states were definitely Florida, definitely Texas, I believe Arizona and California, that they just had astronomical housing. There might have been another one too. There had astronomical housing booms. People were creating LLCs and they were borrowing against a previous LLC to buy the new one so that they could, flip that house. And of course, it all came crashing down. And the housing boom just went bust. So Bush is touting that he is going to be at a 4% growth rate on his stewardship while he was governor of Florida. Remember, there was a huge housing bubble. It burst. Everything went to pot. And there were just tremendous amount of foreclosures that went on in Florida. So he's got nothing to stand for in that regard. Dr. Krugman also points out, that Kansas, who is the great experimenter, did cut taxes, did cut corporate taxes, did cut taxes on the wealthy, and after a couple of years, they can't pay for shit, okay? Schools had to close early this year because they didn't have enough money to pay for public schools, to pay for the rest of it. The state couldn't balance the budget. They didn't know what they were going to do. They had to go to the 11th hour. They finally did it by doing what? Of course, they taxed poor people so that the rich people could still have their tax deductions and the corporations could still have their tax deductions. But again, massive amounts, cutting back on road construction, repair, bridges, overpasses, blah, 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 cutting back on education, etc. Just terrible, terrible things that went on in Kansas. So we know, and the reason why Dr. Krugman points this out is because even though none of the Republicans will ever say it, they do want to say, we want to guarantee that we're going to have 4% growth rate, as Jeb has done. And they're not going to tell you what it really is, or the only way that they can have an answer for all of that is by saying, we're way overburdened with regulation, we have way too many taxes, we got to get the taxes down. And then poof, magically, it's all going to happen. And of course, it didn't happen in Kansas when they were the great experiment for the states in doing that. And I'd like to point out, and I don't think Dr. Krugman has said this, but I'm saying this, is that never once in the history of the entire world has it ever been shown that decreasing taxes actually pay for themselves. Never been shown that it has actually worked, and that was started by a guy named Lafler. It was done in the mid-70s. They tried to get it to work in the Reagan administration by the Lafler curve. And what happened when Reagan was spouting this kind of crap in the 1980 election, when his main competition was George Bush? George Bush, the daddy. Now remember, George Bush, the daddy, had been a congressman. He had been the CIA director. He knew, he was a sharp guy. He knew a lot of stuff. What did he call all this stuff? He called it voodoo economics. Because the only answer that you're going to get from the Republicans, if they're going to plead that they're going to get 4% growth rate, is how we're going to do it. We have to unburden regulation. We have to increase the amount of entrepreneurship in the United States. And the only way we could possibly do that is to decrease taxes on the rich. It never happened before. It's never going to happen. But they're still going to spout the same shit. Let's just hope that they can be stopped in their tracks.